Book 5, The Church of the Merchants, Part 3, of The Prophets of Religion, by Upton Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Spook Hunting. Do not imagine that it is only in Geneva that Christian professors realize this peril from the loss of faith. It is never far from the thoughts of any of them, for, of course, no man can look at the present system and not wonder how the poor stand it, and more especially why they stand it. There have been many thinking men who have given up the miracle business quite cheerfully, but have stood appalled at the idea of letting the lower classes find out the truth. You note that idea continually in the writings of Professor Goldwin Smith, who was a free thinker, but also a bourgeois publicist, with a deep sense of responsibility to the money masters of the world. He was about as honest a man as the capitalist system can produce. He was the beau ideal of the New York Evening Post, which indicates his point of view. He wrote: "It can hardly be doubted that hope of compensation in a future state for a short measure of happiness here has materially helped to reconcile the less favored members of the community to the inequalities of the existing order of things." When I was a student in Columbia University, I took a course called Practical Ethics, under a professor by the name of Hislop. The course differed from most of the 40 that I tried, in that it gave evidence that the professor was accustomed to read the morning paper. He had learned that American politics were rotten. His idea of practical ethics was to outline in elaborate detail a complete scheme of constitutional changes which would make it impossible for the "boss" to control the government. I think I must have been born with a charm against bourgeois thought, for the good professor never fooled me an instant. I remember I used to smile at the idea of how quickly the "boss" would brush through his constitutional cobwebs. The reforms required an elaborate campaign of publicity, and of course long before they could be put into practice, the politicians would be ready with devices to make them of no effect. Soon after this my ethical professor resigned and went to hunting spooks. I don't want to be unfair to him. I know that he is a determined and courageous man, and it seems possible that he may really have bagged some spooks. All I wish to point out here is the method he uses in seeking to persuade the heedless rich to support the spook hunting industry. The very same argument as we got from the University of Geneva and the University of Toronto. Says our head spook hunter: "There has been no belief that exercised so much power upon the poor as that in a future life. The politicians, men of the world, have known this so well as to postpone the day of political judgment by it for many years." And again: "The church, having lost all its battles with science, and having abandoned a strenuous intellectual defense of its fundamental beliefs, has lost its power over the poor and the laboring classes. The spiritual ideal of life has gone out of the masses as well as the classes, and nothing is left but a venture on a struggle with wealth." And again, more menacingly yet: "The rich will learn, in the dangers of a social revolution, that the poor will not sacrifice both wealth and immortality." What is to be done about this? The question answers itself. Step up, ladies and gentlemen, and empty your purses into the psychical research hat, so that we may accumulate statistics as to the cost of milk and honey in Jerusalem the Golden. You read what I had to say about Bootstrap lifters and the Wholesale Pickpockets Association, making use of their incantations. You admired my ability to sling language, but not my taste, and you certainly did not think that I would back my rhetoric with facts. But what do these quotations mean, unless they mean what I have said? Are not these three professors men of culture? Are they not as spiritual as any men of learning you can find in our present-day society? And now stop for a moment and put yourself in the position of the young student of the working class, who goes to these books and discovers that truth is not truth, but only a bait for a snare; who discovers that professors of ethics, practical or impractical, are not interested in justice among men, but only in collecting funds for their specialty; that in order to get funds they are willing to teach the rich how to paralyze the minds of the poor. Do you wonder that such young students conclude that bourgeois thinkers do not know what honesty is, but are prostitutes, retainers, and lackeys, to be kicked out of the temple of truth? Running the rapids. And now, can you form to yourselves a clear concept of what it means to society that practically all its moral teaching should be in the hands of men who are incapable of clean, straight thinking? That all the intellectual prestige of the church should be lent to the support of vagueness, futility, and deliberate evasion? Here we are, all of us, caught in the most terrific social crisis of history. I search for a metaphor to picture our position, and I recall a canoe trip in the wilds of Ontario, hundreds of miles down a long, swift river. You sit in the bow of the canoe, your partner in the stern, watching ahead, and there comes a slide of smooth green water, and you go over it, and into a torrent of foaming white, which seizes you and rushes you along with the speed of a racehorse. With every sense alert, you watch for the rocks, and when you see one, you dip your paddle on one side or the other, and with a quick motion draw the canoe clear of the danger. If by any chance you fail to do it, over you go, and your partner with you, and all your belongings go downstream, and maybe you are sucked into a whirlpool, and not seen for several hours afterwards. Precisely like this is the voyage of life, for the whole of society and for every individual. The paddle which would save us from the rocks is experimental science, but in most of our canoes we put a man who has no paddle, but a holy book, and he casts up his eyes and murmurs words in ancient Greek and Hebrew, and now and then, when he sees an especially formidable obstruction, a war, or the gonococcus, or the IWW, he casts a holy wafer upon the foaming torrent. And mind you, it isn't as if I could save myself and you could save yourself. We are all in the same canoe, and we all go overboard together. You, perhaps, have a son who is drafted into the trenches in winter time, and drowned in blood and mud, because in Europe the Catholic party supported militarism, and kept aristocratic criminals in control of states. Or you find yourself involved in a marital tragedy, and in order to free yourself from unendurable misery, you are obliged to go to law courts dominated by the tradition of Paul, the Roman bureaucrat, who despised women, and regarded marriage as a means of gratifying an unclean animal desire. "It is better to marry than to burn," he said, with unmatchable brutality. And so, of course, those who think him a voice of God can form no conception of the dignity and grace of love. And if you want sound and wholesome sex conventions, you will be as apt to find them among the Ashantis or the Kamchadals as among the followers of the Apostle to the Gentiles. You go to a so-called divorce court, which is dominated by this Christian taboo, and exists for the purpose of barring you from a second chance at the gratification of your unclean animal desire. You are not permitted to tell your own story, for that would be collusion. You listen while your intimate friends recite the pitiful and shameful details of your domestic misfortune, under the cross-questioning of lawyers who have suppressed for the time whatever decent instincts they may possess, and follow blindly the details of a prescribed procedure, at the cost of all sincerity, humanity, and truth. The next morning you find that the privacy guaranteed you by law has been taken from you by corrupt court officials, who have sold copies of the testimony to the newspapers, so that all the intimate details of where you slept and where your wife slept and what you saw your wife doing have been thrown out to journalistic jackals who scream with glee as they rend the carcass of your dead love. And in the end, perhaps, you find that you have gone through this horror for nothing. The august court with its Roman Catholic judge throws out your petition, its suspicions having been excited by the fact that when you discovered your domestic tragedy, you sought to behave like a civilized person, with pity and self-restraint, instead of like a sultan in Turkey or a basso in an Italian grand opera. Birth control. I assert that the control of our thinking on ethical questions by minds enslaved to tradition and priestcraft is an unmitigated curse to the race. The armory of science is full of weapons which might be used to slay the monsters of disease and vice, but these weapons are not allowed to be employed, sometimes not even to be mentioned. Consider the misery which is piling itself up in the slums of our great cities, the degenerate, the defective, the insane, who are multiplying as never before in history. There exists a perfectly harmless and painless method of sterilizing the hopelessly unfit, so that they cannot reproduce their hopeless unfitness, but religion objects to this operation, and so the law does not make use of this knowledge. There exists a simple, entirely harmless, and practically costless method of preventing conception, which would enable us to check the blind and futile fecundity of nature, and to multiply as gods instead of as animals. Consider the festering mass of misery in the slums of our great cities. Consider the millions of terrified, poverty-hounded women, bearing one half-nurtured infant after another, struggling desperately to feed and care for them, and seeing them drop into the grave as fast as they are born, until finally the mother, worn out with the Sisyphean labor, gives up and follows her misbegotten offspring. Consider how many women, in their agony and despair, make use of the methods of the primitive savage to escape from nature's curse of fecundity. Dr. William J. Robinson has estimated that in the United States alone there are 1 million abortions every year. And consider that all this hideous mass of suffering, a bloody European war going on continually, unheeded by any newspaper correspondent, might be avoided by the use of a simple sterilizing formula, which we are not permitted to give. The Federation of Catholic Societies have placed a law upon the statute books of the nation, and of all the states as well. The whole power of police and courts and jails is at the service of religious bigots, and a young girl is sent to prison and forcibly fed with a tube through the nose for telling poverty-ridden slum women how to keep from becoming pregnant. And go among these sleek, cynical men of the world, the judges and district attorneys, the commissioners of correction, and doctors who perpetrated this infamy under a so-called "reform" administration in New York City. And what do you find? The first thing you find is that they themselves, one and all, practice birth control with their wives or their mistresses. The second thing you find is that the statute books are crowded with other laws which they make no pretense of enforcing. For example, the law which forbids the saloons to be open on Sunday, which law they take the liberty of understanding to mean that the saloons shall not have their front doors open on Sunday. You will find that they are not at all afraid of the religious taboos. They are afraid of the religious vote, and even more they are afraid of the campaign contributions of sweatshop manufacturers and landlords, who cannot see what would become of prosperity if the women of the slums were to cease to breed. So once more we discover the wolf in sheep's clothing, the traitor, making use of tradition worship, hiding behind the skirts of devout old maiden aunts and grandmothers who repeat the instructions which God gave to Adam and Eve: "Be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth." As if God were as blind as a Fifth Avenue preacher, and could see no difference between the Garden of Eden, full of all fruits that grow and all creatures that run and fly and swim, and a modern East Side tenement room with an oil stove and no windows and no water closet, and the price of cabbage 7 cents a pound. Sheep. There are more than 100,000 Protestant churches in America. They own more than $1 billion worth of property, and in the West and South they dominate the intellectual life of the country. I do not wish to be unfair in what I say of them. They are far more democratic than the Catholic Church. They fight valiantly against the liquor traffic and those forms of graft which are obvious or directly derived from vice. There are among their clergy many men who are honestly seeking light, and trying to make their institutions a factor for progress. But they are caught in the spirit of Lutheran scholasticism, narrow and ignorant, dogmatic and jealous. And they cannot help it, because they are pledged by their creeds and foundations to tradition worship. They have to believe certain things because their ancestors believed them. They have to act in certain ways because of certain facts which existed in the world 3,000 years ago, but which now are known only to historians. You are familiar with the habit of a herd of sheep to follow the example of their leader. If this leader leaps over a stick, all the rest will leap when they come to that spot, even though the stick may have been taken away in the meantime. The scientist explains this seeming foolishness by the fact that sheep once lived in high mountains, and fled from their enemies in swiftly rushing herds. When the leader leaped across an abyss, the others had to leap, without waiting to see in the dust and confusion. Now there are no mountains and no enemies, but the sheep still jump. And in exactly the same way the tailor still sews buttons at the back of your dress coat, because a couple of 100 years ago all gentlemen wore swords. In the same way our railroad builders make cars narrow and uncomfortable and liable to overturn, because 100 years ago all cars were hauled by mules. In the same way the Orthodox Hebrew will eat no pork, in spite of the fact that the microscope affords him complete protection against disease. The Orthodox Catholic will not eat meat on Friday, because he thinks Jesus was crucified on that day. The Orthodox Anglican will not marry his deceased wife's sister because of something he reads in Leviticus. The Orthodox Baptist requires total immersion, in a climate quite different from that of Palestine. The Orthodox Methodist refuses to enjoy fresh air and exercise on the Sabbath. In ancient Judea, you see, the people lived an open-air life, tending sheep and working the fields, so it was an excellent thing for them to rest from labor one day of the week, and to gather in temples, to hear the reading of the best literature of their time. But nowadays the city slave spends his weekdays shut up in an office, poring over a ledger, or in a sweatshop, chained to a sewing machine. Obviously, therefore, the thing to do on the seventh day is to lure him into the open air and persuade him to run and play. But do we do that, we human sheep? We write ancient Hebrew laws upon our modern statute books, and if the city slave goes into a vacant lot and tries to play baseball, we send a policeman and take him to jail, and next morning he is fined $5 and probably loses his job. In the city where I live, a city supposed to be free and enlightened, but in reality heavily burdened with churches, there are tennis courts, built and paid for out of public funds, my own included. Yet I cannot use these tennis courts on Sunday, because of the ancient Hebrew taboo. My mail is not delivered to me. The swimming pool in the park is closed to me. The library is closed nearly all day. If I inquire about it, I am told that it is desirable that city employees should have one day's rest a week. But when I ask why it might not be possible to relay the employees, so that they might all have 1 or even 2 days rest a week, and still give the public their rights on Sunday, there is no answer. But I know the answer, having probed our politics of hypocrisy. There is a church vote, at which all politicians tremble. There are clergymen, humanly jealous when their peculiar graft is threatened, and hoping that if the law enforces a general boredom, the public may be more disposed to endure the boredom of sermons. In New York City the theaters are closed on Sunday. But moving pictures having come into being since the days of Puritan rule, the picture shows are free to keep open. The law permits sacred concerts, which, under the benevolent sway of Tammany, has come to mean any sort of vaudeville. So what we have is a free rein to the imbecilities of Mutt and Jeff, and the obscenities of Anna Held and Gabby Durlis, while we bar the greatest moralists of our times, such as Ibsen and Brieux. I speak with some crossness of this Sabbath taboo, because of an experience which once befell me. In the second decade of this century of enlightenment and progress, in our free American democracy, whose Constitution proclaims religious toleration and forbids the establishment by the state of any form of worship, I was made to serve a sentence of 18 hours in the state prison of Delaware for playing a game of tennis on the Sabbath. I was duly arrested upon a warrant, duly sentenced by a magistrate, duly clad in a prison costume, duly set to work upon a stone pile, duly locked up overnight in a steel-barred cell full of vermin, in a building housing some 500 wretches, black and white, 30 of them serving life terms under circumstances which never permitted them a breath of fresh air nor a glimpse of the sunshine or the sky. They had no exercise court to their prison, and the inmates were not permitted to speak to one another, but ate their meals in dead silence, and walked back to their cells with folded arms, and had their only occupation working for a sweatshop contractor. This on the outskirts of the pious city of Wilmington, with no less than 91 churches. The writer was informed that he would return to this institution regularly every week unless he abandoned his godless habit of playing tennis on a private club court on Sunday. He only escaped the painful punishment by making the discovery that at the Wilmington Country Club it was the custom of the leading officials of the city and state to play golf every Sunday, and by threatening to employ detectives and have these mighty ones arrested and sent to their own prison. Which shows again the importance of understanding this relationship of superstition and big business. End of Book 5, Part 3. End of Book 5.